The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, welcome everybody to the Yaron Brook Show on this, I think it's Wednesday night. It's the end of June. I mean, time is starting to fly. It's starting to move really, really fast. I know time is always the same, but it feels like it's moving really, really fast. It was slow there for a while, like March and April kind of barely moved, and now it's starting to run away. So here we are at the end of June, and thank you for joining me tonight. We're going to talk about racism again today, racism of the left, from the left, and we're going to analyze a video. So we're going to spend most of the show on this one video because I think it's so common and so prevalent now. This attitude of white privilege, white fragility, white guilt, however you want to call it, that I thought it was worthwhile to devote some significant time to this. It's a video. This is an interesting video because this video was actually sent to me by somebody who's pretty senior at Amazon, saying that this is a video that Amazon management has been circulating among the employees. That is, this is something that supposedly Amazon management this is their response to the whole Black Lives Matter demonstrations, riots, murder, the murder in Minneapolis and now in Atlanta. So this is their response, this video. So that, just keep that in mind. This is a video that many corporations around the country are distributing. It is a video by Dr. Robin DiAngelo. I've talked about Robin DiAngelo in the past. Now I know it's a woman. I talked about her as if she was a man before, so I apologize about that. But it's a video by her. She is, she wrote a book called White Fragility, which is a best-selling book. She also wrote a book, What Does It Mean to Be White, and a book, so she is this huge figure. She is also somebody who does seminars for corporations, for businesses. They bring you in to do, I guess, race sensitivity training or whatever it's called. She's massively popular. This particular video is on Vimeo, and it has 75,000 views, but her other stuff is massive. And again, it's endorsed. Whoops, I think my volume's really high. I think that's better. It's endorsed by the kind of, the mainstream. So she is not a Black Lives Matter founding Marxist, radical, anti-everything in the West, anti-American. She's not that. She's like a center-left, mainstream. This has become mainstream perspective on race. So we're going to go over her video, which is pretty bad, and see where it takes us. So I thought that's the program for today, because it's everywhere. She, by the way, calls herself, or she's described as an anti-racist educator. Now, I did a show, a week ago, whatever, on the racism of anti-racism, on how the anti-racists are racists. The whole attitude of anti-racism is racist. And I think this video will illustrate that in kind of very stark, immediate terms. And but I think it's useful for you guys because particularly the white privilege, I'm privileged, you're privileged, who's privileged, they're privileged, is everywhere. It's all around us. So, this title of this talk is Deconstructing White Privilege. Deconstructing White Privilege. So I guess we'll jump into it. I'll just remind you, that we are shooting for 20,000 subscribers, so we're very close. Less than 500 to go. So if you haven't subscribed, and I know about a third to 40% of my listeners are not subscribers, so it'd be great if you guys could subscribe. And if not, then, subscribe, of course. Also like, share, and of course, for those of you who are not yet supporters of the show, who not yet contribute to financially to the show, I really appreciate your support. Those of you who are contributors, thank you. It is really, really great. Good. Now, to what extent is D'Angelo popular? I think she's very popular among kind of, I'd say, mainstream left. She's very, very influential in corporate America. She's very, very influential among the movers and shakers. I think the popular people out there, almost nobody wants to be called a racist, which she basically says if you're white, whatever the hell that means, if you've got white skin, then you're by definition a racist. So that's why I think there's some resistance to her. Michael asks, when you're finally ready to start a revolution, how will you let us know? I'm not going to start a revolution, so that's your job. In this sense, I am willing to be the intellectual that helps. I'm willing to help strategy-wise. I'm willing to help in a variety of different ways. But revolution is a young man's game. Revolution is something you have to be young and energized and physical, and you have to do crazy things. And you have to believe in your ability to succeed. I believe a revolution today would fail. It would be a disaster. The world is not ready for a revolution. They're not ready for our revolution. You need to lay a lot of groundwork for that revolution, which is what I view myself as doing. I'm laying the foundation, the groundwork, the intellectual work for that revolution. Of course, who really laid that foundation for the revolution is Ayn Rand. But I'm doing my best right now to represent that point of view as the foundation of revolution. But you guys will have to launch it, and since it's not going to be anytime soon, I expect to be significantly older when you do, and I'll support you in any way that I can. I'll help, but you're going to have to come to me, not the other way around. You're going to have to come to me and say, "This is our plan. How can you help us? What can you do to support it?" So, don't look for me to start the revolution. I will be happy to support it in ways that I can. If it's a sane revolution, if it's not nuts, if it's for the right cause and it's done in a smart way and a clever way and so on. But it's not going to be my revolution. You have to believe you have a long future, and it's going to be a long fight. So I'll help write the Constitution. Although again, to write a proper Constitution, you need to be a legal scholar, which I'm not. But I'll help get the people together to write a constitution. I'll organize. I'll be the organizer of the intellectual work necessary, and I'm happy to be part of the military strategy as well. But I suspect it ain't happening. So, but my point is, it's your revolution. All right, I'm not going to take any more of your questions until afterwards, because otherwise I'm never going to get to the topic of today, which is white fragility. I don't even know what that term means. So we're going to discover this as we hear from Robert D'Angelo. Hopefully she gets to it. I don't know if I'll be able to tolerate the whole video. It's about 20 minutes. We'll see if we can get past 5:10, but we're going to go for it. All right, let's see. Yeah, that's the video. You ready? You got your seatbelt on? You ready to be offended? Maybe a safe space. Find a safe space. Find a cute little teddy bear or something, and a lot of tissue paper, and be ready to be offended by Dr. Robin D'Angelo. All right, what happened? Here we go. Oops, I need my headphones.
I'm Dr. Robin D'Angelo, and my work focuses on the question of what does it mean to be white in a society that proclaims race meaningless, yet is profoundly separated by race.
Now notice, her work is about what it means to be white. That is what it means to be of a particular skin color. Where do you start with that? It means that you've got certain pigments that shape your skin color white. I mean, just by framing it that way, she's framing it in a racist way. Now, let me say something about what I mean by racism. Racism is treating a person based on his ethnic, genetic origins, his skin color, or some other characteristic that has to do with the origins of his genes. Not even the particular genes that he has, but the origin of the genes, the group to which his genes belongs to. Racism is treating an individual not as an individual, not as a particular person, but as a member of a group identified not even by his country, but by its genetic origins or by skin color. Literally, I cannot think of many more barbaric things than racism. That is, not looking at somebody and evaluating their character, their values, their virtues, their success, their failures, their value to you. No. Looking at somebody and saying, oh, he's white. Oh, he's black. Oh, he's brown. And making an evaluation based on that. So the fact that she studies what it means to be having a particular skin color, it's like, what does it mean to have green eyes? What does it mean to have brown eyes? The green-eyed people don't like, I mean, what? It's just stupidity and racism.
And to start this off, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I'm white.
Now, this is particularly disgusting. Draw your attention to the fact that I have a particular skin color. She's also got dark hair. I don't know what her eye color is. I really don't care. But she has a particular shaped nose and a particular shaped mouth, and she has particular shaped fingers. I don't know. She has who cares? Skin color. That's what matters.
Just look at me for a moment, think about it, notice it. And part of being white is that it's a very uncomfortable thing for me to do. And it's taken me many, many years to be able to draw people's attention to my race and see any significance. And that's because as a white person, I was socialized to see race as what they had. I was just a person.
Now, a few things here that she just said. First, you'll see this later. Later on, she denies there is such a thing as race. So the talk right off the bat is full of contradictions. Full of contradictions. So later on, she denies the fact that there is such race, which again is the kind of stuff that the left does all the time. They take the moral high ground. Oh, there's no such thing as race, but there is such. But I'm white, and you're black, and you're green, and you know whatever, right? So they take something that they believe doesn't exist, and then they attribute to it massive significance. They are so dishonest in that sense. So creepily dishonest in that sense. And then she says, it took me a long time to figure out that this is important. And it's uncomfortable. Because race is something we attribute to them, but we treat ourselves as individuals. Now, there's a certain truth to that. There's a certain group, among Americans, there's a certain group, call them white racists, who think of themselves as individuals, and many of them fly the banner of capitalism and individual rights, but they consider anybody who looks differently from them as inferior. So they view race as belonging to somebody else. And of course, in more recent times, what's happened is that group is now self-identified with their own race, which is white. And I don't see much difference between her, who is going to be apologetic about the fact that she's white, and the white supremacists. The fundamental difference, the fundamental sameness between all of them is the importance they place on the color of their skin, is the importance they place on so-called race. the importance they place on the group to which they belong. The fact that they do not, cannot, will not identify as individuals, and not only identify themselves as individuals, but identify others as individuals. So what all this is collectivism on steroids. And everything, the whole frame of mind, the whole way she thinks about these issues, you'll notice, is purely collectivist. There is no individual. There is no individual mind. There are no individual choices. All there is the group you belong to, and the other group, the group you do not belong to. Now, the modern view of racism is that only the dominant view, only the dominant race, and I put race in quotes because I don't believe there is such a thing, can be racist. That the oppressed group cannot be racist. But that is a perversion of the concept. The concept of racism applies to anybody, oppressed or oppressor, who treats people, views people as member of a race rather than as individuals. That's what racism means. And it goes in all directions. All right. So notice this. She's white. She's, in a sense, it's important to her she's white. And there's some baggage that comes with being white, which she's going to get into.
I was just a white bread, a Heinz 57. I didn't have race. I was socialized to see race as individual acts of discrimination and prejudice.
Which is actually what racism is. But notice, too, there's no free will in her story. And she's not what she does is combine two aspects of determinism. She is a gene determinist. That's her racism. That's her whiteness, although she rejects that later. More importantly, she is a social determinist. She constantly talks about, I was socialized to. I was socialized to. Every idea she had in her head, she was socialized to. Nothing was her conclusion. Everything was how she was socialized. And she attributes that to all of us. You will see. All of us are being socialized to view the world in a particular way. View race in a particular way. And for example, one of the things we socialize to, God forbid, is the view of colorblindness. The view that color doesn't matter. We were socialized to view ourselves as individuals and not member of this collective. That's not a positive in her mind. That is a negative, that we were socialized to that.
Individual acts that anybody could do to anybody else, and if you did those acts, you were a bad person.
All that is true. What's wrong with that?
And that is why, since I saw myself as a good person, I didn't see myself as connected to racism, and certainly didn't see myself as connected to race. In other words, I didn't have a sense of a racial identity. Today,
and that's good, by the way. That's the way you should have stayed. But she's got a doctor in front of her name, so I assume she got a PhD. My guess is that's where she got corrupted while going to school, while being socialized into academia. That's where these bogus notions of race were implanted. She adopted them, right? By choice. She has free will.
Understand that I move through the world always and most particularly as a white person. I have a white frame of reference and I have a white experience.
So you move through the world as a white person with a white frame of reference and white experience. I'm going to try to turn her volume down. Tell me if that worked. And tell me if it's too much. Wow. Right. Again, she experiences the world not as an individual, but as a white person. What does that mean? Does she experience the world the same as I do? Because I happen to have the same skin color? And let's abstract away the fact that I'm genetically, supposedly, whatever it means, Jewish. I don't know if that differentiates us or not. D'Angelo, she's not Jewish. So she experiences the world. Weird.
And part of being white is to have that be invisible to us and to be able to live our lives without ever acknowledging that, to see that as non-operative. I now understand racism as a system, as a deeply embedded system, a system that our country was founded on and that all our institutions were created out of.
Now notice, this is a gimmick, a trick that they play on us. Moral judgment can only be placed fundamentally on an individual. You can place moral judgment on a system. The system of slavery is immoral. But fundamentally, the actions taken by individuals are moral or immoral. And the system is a system created by individuals. And the system is a system upheld by individuals. And a system, in a sense, is the cumulative actions of individuals. You can't have a racist system if individuals are not racist, for example. Notice also she believes the country was founded on a system of racism. Ignore 90% of what America represents. Ignore the Declaration of Independence. Ignore what was written down. The fact of slavery is the dominant fact. It's the only fact that's relevant for these people. It makes nothing else matters. The fact that the Declaration of Independence indeed lays the foundation for the elimination of slavery, the elimination of racism in the end. Underpinning the Declaration is the morality of individualism, which rejects racism. Ignore all that. That we created a government of checks and balances and that protects individual rights. Again, the Constitution, which lays the foundation for the elimination of slavery and ultimately the elimination of all racism, institutionalized racism. All of that is ignored. Basically, she takes, and I'm sure she's been involved, in the New York Times 1619 Project, which basically says the defining characteristic of America, indeed the only thing that really matters about America, is racism. America was established to protect racism, to protect slavery. The Declaration and Constitution are just pretenses at some kind of universal rights of man. They didn't care. They didn't matter. What mattered was that the founding preserved slavery. That even when we fought a civil war to eliminate slavery, we maintained Jim Crow. And even when we got rid of Jim Crow, we continue to have institutionalized racism. And indeed, the argument is that by being white, we have no choice. Even if we are immigrants to this country, we have no choice by being but to be part of a system of institutionalized racism against black Americans. I mean, it is such a perversion of history. First, slavery has been a part of the human race forever. It's in the Old Testament. Jews have slaves. Jews are slaves. In Egypt, right? And then Jews have slaves. Everybody has slaves. The Romans had slaves. The Greeks had slaves. Now, I'm not justifying slavery. I'm just saying it's been a feature of human existence forever. And then, in a miraculous period of some, 60, 70 years, slavery basically is outlawed, is deemed morally reprehensible, and is banned from human society. And it all happens within a few decades of the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Inspired by, and you can see it in all of the people who fought for getting rid of slavery, whether here or in England and other places, inspired by the idea of all men are created equal in the Declaration, inspired by the idea of individual rights, inalienable individual rights, which we all have because we're human. I mean, it's to not see the causal relationship between the founding of the United States of America and the elimination of slavery. Now, this is not to excuse the fact that there was slavery in America. This is not to excuse the founding fathers who had slaves. They should be morally condemned for that. But at the same time, not to see that it was them, their words, their ideas, their philosophies, their teachings, their writings, that made the elimination of slavery ultimately possible in England, which not just banned slavery for themselves, but banned the slave trade. And then ultimately in the United States, by Lincoln and through a civil war, is just not to understand history. It's not to understand anything about human beings. It's to view everything through one prism. A racist prism. I mean, the real ugly truth is that the defenders of racism today, the people who propagate racism today, are leftist intellectuals in our universities. They are the equivalent of the intellectuals of the South who defended slavery at the time. So today they're not defending slavery, but they are defending racism. Now, this is not to deny that white racism against blacks has been around forever in this country. It's not to deny the evil of slavery. It's not to deny the evil of Jim Crow. It's not to deny the evil of individual acts of racism. And it's certainly not to deny the systemic racism that existed before the civil rights, before the 1960s, where in the law you had racist policies. But you don't justify laws that discriminate against somebody who would happen to have a white skin. You don't justify that. History does not justify racism. You don't fix an evil by creating an evil. The fact that you're poor, you're suffering, that you are being discriminated against, that you're at a disadvantage, does not justify your racism. Ayn Rand wrote in an essay called The Age of Envy, in The Return of the Primitive, she wrote, "Today racism is regarded as a crime if practiced by a majority, but as an inalienable right if practiced by a minority. The notion that one's culture is superior to all others solely because it represents the traditions of one's ancestors is regarded as chauvinism if claimed by a majority, but as ethnic pride if claimed by a minority." So Ayn Rand rejects racism in every direction, by any individual or group. But what the left today does is it places virtue, morality, identity in one's race. And in doing so, it is the most racist movement today in America. And I think much of the white racism that exists today, and I think it's rising, and I think it's increasing, and I think it's becoming very, very dangerous. Some of it has always been in America. And some of it now has become a response to the intellectuals of the left. a response to the identity politics that's reflected by people like Robin DiAngelo. Okay, let's keep listening.
And every institution reinforces this system.
Every institution reinforces the system. Like what? What institutions? Like, give us an example. Like, how do universities reinforce the system given affirmative action? Given what is being taught in the humanities? Doesn't this institution indeed reinforce your point of view? Isn't your point of view now dominant at the universities? Then why is the system still in existence if you are running the system? Does it exist in every workplace in America? These broad generalizations, without examples. I'm not going to let her talk. I'm going to comment on what she says. You can all go listen to a video and watch the whole thing straight and enjoy it. I'm here to comment on her stuff, and I'm going to expect to comment 5 minutes on every minute she has, because, she's got the floor, and this is my one opportunity to go at her. If you ever want to organize a debate between me and her, love to do it.
And it's a system of unequal power. So let me give you an example. Women in the United States got the right to vote in 1920. And there was only one possible way that we could have gotten the right to vote, and that was for men to give it to us, because we literally were not sitting in the seats of institutional power. We could not give ourselves the right to vote. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have personal power, but we didn't have institutional power. And that's the difference between a system and individual acts.
So what does that even mean? So it's true. The woman could not get the right to vote until men who had the right to vote could vote for them to have the right to vote. And that's, again, a tragedy of the Declaration of Independence and of the starting of the country, that women didn't have the right to vote. But again, there's a history there. Women have not had a right to vote anywhere, and America was one of the first countries to allow women to vote and give them right to property, and not give them the right to property, recognize their right to property, and recognize the fact that they are equal to men from a rights perspective. That was an achievement. And the system was geared against women before that. Okay. What is the equivalent of that? Clearly, slavery was systemic racism. Clearly, Jim Crow laws were systemic racism. Clearly, laws that didn't allow women to vote were systemic. Now what? Now what?
Prior to women's suffrage, I could certainly discriminate against men. I could be unfair to individual men, but my group could not systematically deny men as a group the right to vote. And men controlled all the institutions, and they all worked together to convey the message that women's place was here and men's place was there.
And then it
changed. That's the difference between individual prejudice and a system of inequality.
Note how she switches here. And she does this all the time. And we'll see if I can catch her every time she does it. A system of prejudice and a system of inequality. What kind of inequality? They never define their terms. They never define their terms. Inequality, what kind of inequality? Economic inequality? Or political inequality? Political inequality is bad. Political inequality is usually a reflection of racism or prejudice. But is that what she's talking about? Or something else? Also note that yes, men could stop women from having the vote, but how did that change? It changed because individual men changed their minds. Individual women fought for it. Individual women got together in organizations and lobbied and fought and argued and debated and wrote and spoke and convinced men, some men, not all men, to change their minds. And they did change their minds. Because individuals have free will. Individuals can think of themselves. Individuals can change their minds. It wasn't the group suddenly got the revelation that women should have the vote. It was hard fought. And lots of individual minds needed to be changed. But in her universe, the individual doesn't exist. It's just groups. It's just gangs. It's just tribes. Men, black, white, women, black, white. And of course, there are all kinds of relationships of power between them, which is the whole intersectionality story, which I've done shows on in the past and probably will have to do shows on in the future because it doesn't look like it's going away.
So in this field, we think about oppression, or in this case racism, as group prejudice backed by institutional power.
Group prejudice backed by institutional power. That's what racism is. No, that's not what racism is. But that is a manifestation, can be a manifestation of racism. The question is, what is the group? Who is the group? I assume whites. And what is the institutional power they have? Where does that institutional power manifest itself? So we'll see the example she uses.
And so prior to the civil rights movement, it was fairly socially acceptable for white people to just come out and say, we are superior. My father certainly was comfortable saying that. The great joke of Archie Bunker and all of the family was that he wasn't up with the times and he was still saying things that conveyed this idea. But post-civil rights, it became bad to be racist, right? It became unacceptable to be racist.
Isn't that a good thing? You think that would be something to be celebrated?
And that seems like a positive thing, right? Racism's bad. But unfortunately, what it morphed into is to make it impossible for white people to look at racism, because what we hear is, I would have to be a bad person in order to perpetuate racism. It became a moral issue.
Isn't it a moral issue? Isn't racism a moral issue? Isn't to be a racist and to perpetuate racism and to be involved in the perpetuation of racism a bad thing? But she's going to say no. She's going to say, you're part of a racist system even though you individually are not racist, and you have to recognize that. And so it doesn't put moral blame on you as an individual. It puts moral blame on the system while freeing the individuals from moral blame, which is very dangerous. You're not at fault. It's just the system that is at fault.
In addition to years of reflection and study of my own racial identity, and
she needed years of reflection and study to figure out her own racial identity. I mean, it's truly spooky language. Really spooky, racist language.
Shapes my life and my experience and my perspectives. I've had the very rare opportunity to, for a living, day in and day out, lead primarily white groups of people in discussions of race and racism. And there are some very, very predictable patterns that come up in these conversations. And as I listen to these, it's almost like a script, right? That, like, it's almost as if, as white folks, we just pick up this script and we say the same things again and again.
Us white folks, we're all the same. We all say the same stuff. We have the same script because we've been socialized in the same way.
And as a sociologist, rather than seeing something that's patterned as meaning therefore it's true, I look at something patterned as very revealing of how we get socialized to see things and to see the world. And then the next question that follows that is, and so how does that function? Right? And when we look around us, we can see that although we have changes since the civil rights movement and we have this idea of racism being bad, we still have the same unequal outcomes by race.
So now it's unequal outcomes by race. Now it's not equality before the law. Now it's not discrimination. It's not legal discrimination. It's unequal outcomes by race. Now, you know, the whole idea of equality of outcome is a very dangerous, very, very dangerous idea. Now, there is a good question of, if you see whole groups that are fundamentally different and the outcome is fundamentally different, then it's legitimate to ask the question of, well, what's going on? Right? But it's not clear, right? So while it's true that blacks as a group do worse economically than whites, and there's certain historical reasons for that, that have to do with accumulation of wealth over generations that they didn't get an opportunity to do because of institutionalized racism before the civil rights. It's also true that some blacks are very successful, very successful in academia, in business, in every aspect. Lawyers, doctors, in everything, right? They're just as successful as anybody else. But again, individuals don't matter. What matters is these group things. And the only explanation that is possible for this inequality is racism. But not the racism of you discriminating against somebody. Institutional racism. The system is racism. The system somehow is holding them down. And I did a whole thing on systemic racism. You can find that in my videos from about a week ago, 2 weeks ago.
Every measure we have racial inequality. So how do we have such different narratives than we had prior to the civil rights movement and still have unequal outcomes?
Because it would be bizarre if you had equal outcomes, particularly given the unequal history. Even if you had complete laissez-faire capitalism, which we don't, of course, even if you didn't have all the things holding back the black community, like welfare, like minimum wage, like licensing laws, like the war on drugs, like everything else, you still wouldn't have equality. And equality doesn't matter. What matters is individuals have maximizing their opportunities. And then it's a question of whether they take advantage of those opportunities. And that also has to be asked. Are people taking advantage of their opportunities? Do they live in a culture which encourages taking opportunities and succeeding?
And as I listen to white folks, my group, repeat these narratives over and over, I got this image of a dock, like a pier, and it's just floating on the water, and that's all the superficial things that we say. And you probably recognize some of these, you hear them, maybe you've said them yourself.
These are superficial.
I don't see color, I was taught to treat everybody the same, I don't care if you're pink, blue, purple, polka dotted, my parents weren't racist, that's why I'm not racist, or my parents were racist, that's why I'm not racist. It doesn't really matter what goes in front of it.
How are those superficial? I don't see race, I don't care about race, which is what all of those represent. That is deep. That's a huge achievement. But that to her is unreal because it doesn't conform with her priors. The prior that shapes her thinking is there's racism everywhere. The inequality that we see around us is a consequence of racism. There is no other explanation for it. Therefore, everything people are saying is meaningless. It's just a disguise. It's not real.
The answer is always, I'm not racist, I know people of color, I used to work in the military. All of the things we say to rationalize that we ourselves are not complicit in this system. Now I want to speak to two of these before I kind of take us below the surface of the dock. And one is this idea that our parents taught us to treat everyone the same. And I am just going to put it out there like this. No, they didn't. That is not humanly possible. Human beings are not objective. You cannot be taught to treat or to see everyone the same. And when you say that, you're indicating that you don't understand how socialization works, which is actually a positive thing in the sense that that can direct what you would need to focus on if you want to get deeper understanding. The other one I want to speak to is this common trope of, I don't care if you're pink, purple, polka dotted. If that's in your vocabulary, I would urge you to please drop it and never say it again.
Why?
Although it isn't intentional, it's actually very demeaning. People don't come in those colors, and what it conveys is that you're not prepared to engage with authenticity.
In other words, you're not willing to engage in the fact that you are racist. You're not willing to engage in the fact that you are inherently a racist, no matter what you actually do.
And that's why I have this image of a dock, right? That's very superficial surface. And for me, in trying to understand how all this works, what it means to be white, and live so separate by race, even though I have was taught to see myself individually as open-minded and outside of all.
Her parents were pretty good, although she said her father was a racist. So that's kind of interesting. Her father was a racist, but she was taught to be open-minded and to view herself as an individual and not view other people based on their race. What happened to you? You sounds like you got a decent education. I think what happened to her, she got a PhD.
I've had to go under the surface. And that's why I have this image here now of under the water. You see the pillars or posts that prop up the surface. Okay? So, for example, it's very common in discussions of race to have white people tell you about all the people of color in their lives, right? Oh, I have these coworkers, or my best friend, or my second cousin married a black man, or all of the ways that we want everyone to know that we have relationships with people of color, okay? And so we're giving you evidence. Right? When someone tells you that, they're giving you evidence. And so what are they giving you evidence of? They're giving you evidence that because they love people of color, know and love people of color, they can't be racist, which means they see racism as conscious dislike or...
What else is it? It's conscious dislike. It's conscious discrimination. That's what racism is. So if you have friends, if you have loved ones who are of a different race, you're probably not a racist. But that, again, doesn't fit her priors.
Explicit bias or hatred, right? And they're communicating to you that they don't have conscious dislike
That's
or
right.
hatred, as evidenced by all of these people in their lives. And what we don't understand is the power of implicit bias. Most bias is unconscious.
Most bias is unconscious. Because we're not in control of our own lives. We're not in control of the decisions that we make. Now, let's say that is true. Let's say there is significant unconscious bias. But when you make a decision, you make it consciously. So you can ignore the unconscious bias. Now, maybe when you're making very quick decisions, you can't. But most important decisions we make in life are not quick decisions. They're thoughtful. We weigh the evidence. We look at facts. We use reason. And when we notice racist ideas coming into our thinking, we can easily suppress those, reject them as irrational, and move on. So even if you have unconscious biases, you are not a racist. Even if you have unconscious biases, if you don't act on them, if you don't allow them to corrupt your thinking, your actions, then you are not a racist. But again, to some extent for her, everything about us is unconscious because we are deterministic beings. We're determined by our environment, by our socialization. We're determined by our implicit biases. And you see, you can't win with these people. Because even if you act 100% non-racist, even if you act every single day of your life as a good, rational human being, even if consciously you reject the idea of race as irrational and silly, as a man-made mechanism to feel superior to others. That's why racism, the whole idea of race came into existence. You're still not a good person. You're still not free of racism because you've got those implicit biases. And those, you know what, you can't really get rid of those. So you're always going to be a racist.
And that makes it very, very dangerous because it drives our behaviors, but we're not aware of it.
So you're not aware of the behaviors. You're not aware of what drives your behaviors. You're not a thinking being. You're not a reasoning being. You're not a choosing being. You're just a being that is driven by a subconscious.
Yes, it's wonderful to have people of color in your life if you're white. Many, many, many people, white people, don't have people of color.
That is so disgusting. Yes, it's wonderful that you have people of non-color in your life. Who the hell does she think she is? It's so pretentious and aloof and superior. It's
relationships. But that doesn't mean your life is free of racism. That doesn't mean you don't have a white experience or a white perspective.
No, but you're the one who says you have a white experience and a white perspective, you are the racist. Now, she's going to admit to being a racist in a minute, so it's not going to become a shock to her, but she is the racist.
And it also doesn't mean that racism will not surface in your relationships with people of color. So if we go underneath and we look at the pillars that are supporting that kind of superficial ways that we're taught to think about racism, we see individualism as a very powerful prop or support. This idea...
So individualism is a prop. Aye.
That each of us is unique and outside of socialization. We see universalism, which is kind of the opposite of individualism.
No, universalism is not opposite of individualism. Universalism is the recognition that as individuals, we still have some universal values. There's certain things that are true of all individuals. Man is the rational being. That's a universal principle that applies to all individual men. So again, no real understanding of the concept she's talking about, and a rejection of individualism, which she does explicitly, which
why
is
can't
true
we
of
all be
these
different?
people.
And universalism says, why can't we all be the same? This is a very popular ideology in religious or faith communities. And I'm not arguing that on a deep spiritual level, we're not all universally the same. But we don't live, if you will, in the spiritual realm. We live in the physical realm. And here in the physical realm, we have to ask ourselves, how does it function to say we all bleed under the skin? Well, it functions to take race off the table, to take power off the table.
It functions to take race off the table. Isn't that a good thing? Isn't that the purpose of fighting racism, is to take race off the table?
To deny that we have fundamentally different experiences because racism is real.
No, it isn't. I mean, racism is real, but that's because you choose it to be real. It's because you identify with your race, which in a few seconds you're going to say doesn't even exist.
And while race isn't real, in other words, at the
She just said it, right? I said a few seconds. I was right. It was less than a few seconds. It was right there. Right? She said
able to deny that we have fundamentally different experiences because racism is real. And while race isn't real, in other words, at the biological level, there is no real, true race.
That's true. First thing I agreed with Dr. Robin DiAngelo. Finally, we agree on something. Race isn't real. Race isn't real, and race explains nothing. I think I gave the example yesterday. The most well-educated minority group, nationality in the United States is, and you guys guessed, and you guessed Asian, and you guessed Chinese, and you guessed Jewish, and you guessed Ashkenazi Jews, and you guessed all this other stuff. And the answer was Nigerian. And the Nigerians have the highest educational levels per capita in the United States. Race is unreal. It is a fiction. It was made up in the 19th century by somebody who started measuring different skulls. It is complete BS. It is complete BS, and if you do 23andMe, you can see how BS it is. And of course, since what you are, who you become, what you make of yourself is something you do. You are a self-made being. You are not the creature of your genes. You are not your creature of your environment. You're a creature of your own choices. Free will is real, but it's not just real and there and who cares. It is the determining factor in your life. It is. It is. What will determine the kind of soul and the kind of life and the kind of future you will have. And what she, the white supremacists, and all the racists agree on is a rejection of free will as fundamental to who we are and what we make of ourselves. Because they're all in the end two things. They're collectivists and they are determinists. And that can only lead to bad things. Only lead to bad things.
difference as we're taught to understand it, these very superficial signifiers of racial difference.
Now suddenly it's superficial. Before, look at me, I'm white, look how wonderful it is. Now it's superficial.
That allow us to categorize people, these are very real in their consequences for people's lives. And this insistence that we're all one doesn't allow us to engage with that social reality.
But they're only important because people are racist, because people take these ideas seriously and you're encouraging them to do it.
Try to help white people see how race functions in our lives. And I try to move us away from the really obvious, evident examples, such as a racist joke or a racist action, or things that would be recognizable to everybody, right? The kinds of acts that cause people like me, well-meaning people like me, to say, I couldn't possibly be racist, I don't do those things. And I try to help white people understand racism as the very fabric of our society.
Wow. Racism is the very fabric of our society. That is so disgusting and so untrue. Racism exists, but the very fabric of our society in America today, when you go to work, when you do business, when you cut deals, when racism is the very fabric of our society, this is nuts. And this is what the white supremacists, including those right now on my chat, this is what they're responding to. This is their response.
I think the most profound example of everyday racism is segregation. That most white people live in racial segregation. While we may work with people of color, when we go home, people of color are rarely at our dinner table. And I don't mean setting our table. I mean sitting and breaking bread with us, true relationships in our lives.
Now, that is probably true. There are very few people who are married to across races. There are a variety of reasons for that. Partially, it's economic differences. They grow up in different places. Partially, it's racism. And partially, it's a culture that has been offended by that. But that's changed. Certainly in the last 20 years, I don't think anybody makes a big deal, or any kind of deal, by a mixed-race couple. I'm not sure, but it's also true that blacks are, 13% of the population? She'd expect if everybody got cross-racial, it would be the whole thing is, there's too much racism in both directions in our culture. And there are too many cultural differences that come from the fact that we are segregated. But the segregation is not because of anything that's happening in the world today, other than economics. The segregation today is primarily a consequence of what? Of the past, of redlining, of truly systemic racism of 50 years ago. And as a consequence of that segregation that existed in the past as part of our legal system, as part of real racism, different cultures have evolved. The black communities have different cultures than white communities because they've lived together for a long time. They weren't allowed to live anywhere else. And that is a true tragedy and truly bad. And then, unfortunately, at the same time as we liberated them from those laws, we also started a war on poverty and a welfare state, which kept them poor, or kept many of them poor. Incentivized them, bad behavior. And again, they tended to aggregate together partially because of those incentives. So, yeah. The segregation is, I agree, a problem. It's a problem with a history. And it's a problem because that history is defined different cultures that now don't completely interact. Although culturally, black culture has become quite popular, right? Rap and dress codes and other things. So it's a very, very confused, it's a very, very complex, it's a very, very difficult story. And to make it simplistic and silly like she does is ridiculous.
Many people can recognize the explicit, kind of conscious dislike type of racism, racist jokes, racist expressions, the KKK. But I want to help white people see the everyday racism that's embedded and that we participate in. And I want to look at neighborhood and school segregation as an example. I'm going to start with this app here. These are the app's founders. It's a new app called The Sketch Factor. And what it does is when you go to a new city, you can put in where you are, and it tells you which neighborhoods to avoid because they're sketchy. And of course, sketchy is very much associated with race and class.
Is it? Is sketchy associated with race? My guess is that, there's certain neighborhoods in West Virginia where there's a lot of white trash that are, I'm picking on West Virginia, there's white trash everywhere, but where those neighborhoods are sketchy and have nothing to do with race. It has something to do with violence. It has something to do with crime. It's something to do with run-down real estate. No? Sketchy is crime, poverty, run-down real estate. That's what sketchy has to do. You're injecting race into it because that's what you do. That's what racism does. So, no, don't blame the people who wrote the app for sketchy neighborhoods. Don't blame me for wanting to know where the sketchy neighborhoods are for being racist. It has nothing to do with race. Everything to do with crime and run-down neighborhoods.
Mind. And so now we have the convenience of segregation through an app. We don't actually have to talk to other white. Where are the good neighborhoods and the bad neighborhoods? And that good neighborhood, bad neighborhood, good schools, bad schools discourse is an example of new racism.
So if I want to say, I want to buy a house in a neighborhood that had good schools, I'm a racist because that means they're going to be, quote, white schools. I mean, give me a break. No, I'm interested in the schools, the quality of the schools, the objective measures of which schools are good or which schools are bad. Mostly they're bad. And that's what I'm using.
I don't think it gets by anybody that is racially coded language. So this way we can come out and police those racial boundaries without ever kind of naming race. But we all know what we're talking about. And I think the most profound way that my life has been shaped by my race is through the power of segregation. Most white people do live in segregation. We choose that segregation.
Do we? I never thought when I chose a house, right? I never thought about who my neighbors were. I mean, obviously, when I choose a house, I chose it in nice neighborhoods, the nicest I could afford. But I never looked at who my neighbors were, the color of their skin. I never looked around to see, what percentage of minorities were in a particular neighborhood. I bought a house because I liked the house. I went to a neighborhood because I liked the neighborhood, not because I liked the color of the skin of the people in the neighborhood, because I liked the way the neighborhood was laid out, the views, the homes, and so on. When I was in married student housing, I took the only housing I could get because it was the cheapest I could find. And I lived there. Then my first apartment that was not married student housing in Austin, Texas, was in relatively cheap, very cheap apartment building. I don't know the race of the people in the building. I think it was very mixed race. I'm pretty sure it was very mixed race. I grew up, the neighborhoods I grew up with, well, in Israel, races are slightly categorized differently, but I grew up in neighborhoods that were basically socioeconomic. When I lived in relatively poor places, I lived with relatively poor kids, whatever race, quote, color skin they had. When I lived in nicer places, they were people of whatever color skin who had, but I mean, make the economic point that why are blacks or why are minorities don't do well economically in America. That's an interesting discussion to have. But this is all, we choose to segregate ourselves? We choose that, really? If there was a beautiful, modern, gorgeous condo in a building and 70% of the people in that building happen to be black, would that stop me from buying the condo? Unequivocally, the answer is no.
And in a lot of ways, we celebrate it. What makes a school good and what makes a neighborhood good? Well, the absence of people of color.
That's not true. That's just not true. And if it is true in some places, then those people are racist. And that's explicit. And that's individual. That's not systemic. That's absolutely a racist behavior. If I choose a school based on the color of the skin of the kids, if I choose a neighborhood based on the color of the skin of my neighbors, that is racism. Individual racism. All right, we're going to give her like a minute or two and then we're done.
White people measure the value of their neighborhoods and schools. And while we don't come out and name that, we all know what it is.
No, we don't. I reject that. Never happened to me.
And so I have had to think very deeply on what it means to have grown up in a primarily white neighborhood, to be born into, to go to school, to study, to learn, to play, to worship, to love, to work, and to die in segregation and not have.
It really is, pretty disgusting. The amount of emphasis they put on your skin color in the name of anti-racism. In the name, you have choices, lady. If you really care, you don't have to live that way. But why should you live any particular way? Shouldn't you choose your friends based on who is of value to you? Based on their character? Shouldn't you choose employees based on their character? Shouldn't you be advocating for that? But that's not what you're advocating. You're advocating for some massive conspiracy, some massive system that is keeping you away somehow from minorities. I mean, it used to be that way in America, and I'm sure to some extent it is. But where it is, it's just plain old racism. That barbaric thing that is racism. That primitive, disgusting, irrational thing that is racism. It's not a system, and it's not some collective guilt, and it's not my fault or yours. Well, maybe it's hers, but yours, the listeners.
Single person who loved, mentored, or guided me convey that there was any loss. And I'm going to repeat that because I think it's very profound and I really want us to sit with it. That I could live my whole life in segregation. In fact, if I followed the trajectory that my loving parents laid out for me in my good neighborhood and my good school and my good college and my good career, in which I would ideally rise to the top, I could easily never have any consistent, ongoing, authentic relationships with people of color.
Well, first, why does that matter? Why does it matter what the color of the skin of the people you have authentic, consistent relationships with is? It should be irrelevant. You should have consistent, authentic relationship with the best people you possibly can. Second, you get to choose the kind of life you want to live. And the fact is that if you went to college in America, most colleges are not segregated. Affirmative action has made sure of that. Most professions, most workplaces are not segregated. So, what exactly are you missing? Even if you land up never having a meaningful relationship with somebody of a different color skin than you, what are you missing? Why is that important? You yourself said, Robin, or Dr. D'Angelo, that race doesn't exist. that it's insignificant, it doesn't matter. If it doesn't matter, if it's insignificant, what are you missing by not having those experiences? Now, I think you're missing a lot if you didn't have those experiences purposefully. If you rejected and denied having an experience with somebody of a different skin color because of their skin color, that's racism. But if you went through life having the best relationships you could, with the best people you could find, living the best life that you could live, and it turned out that at no point in your life did you have a meaningful, deep relationship with somebody with a different color skin, who cares? What exactly did you lose?
One person who guided me ever conveyed that there was loss.
What is the loss? Why is there a loss? She takes it for granted that we all think there's a loss. It's a pure appeal to emotion. There's no there. There's no content. All right, this has been an hour and 10 minutes. She doesn't deserve this much. We did 14 minutes of her talk, and I spoke for an hour on those 14 minutes, approximately, about 50 minutes on those 14 minutes. And, we could go another 6 minutes, and I could speak for another hour, and no, but I'm done. I think you get the point. You can listen to this yourself and pretend that you can hear me speaking in the background. Because I'm sure most of you can replicate that. So hopefully that was, I won't say enjoyable, but educational. Hopefully you saw the kind of BS that these people communicate, the nonsense, I don't know, I find it so disgusting. I really do. They are real racists. All right, so this is becoming the dominant view in academia. She is unbelievably influential. Her books are bestseller. Her book on white fragility, everybody's reading. She's considered mainstream, not a radical leftist. The video I just showed you was circulated by Amazon executives to their staff as part of the healing process around the whole BLM demonstrations. This is considered the best. This is considered the standard of how to approach race today. Somebody says I'm going to get in trouble for this. Actually, I'm not. Who am I getting in trouble with? Who is going to do anything to me about this? Nobody. Nobody. That's the thing. That a lot of the trouble we get into is because we don't speak. But who? I don't report to anybody. I don't get a salary from anybody. I don't think very many people are going to unsubscribe to my channel because of this. I don't think you guys are going to cut your support. Maybe some of you, I hope, will consider actually increasing your support. Luckily for me, I don't think I'm going to get in trouble for this. Is YouTube going to drop this video because of what I said? No. I'll bet you anything they don't. Will they even allow me to monetize this video? That I'm not sure. We'll see if they let this video be monetized. But that's okay. The ads on YouTube, what do I get? $5 a day on ads? Almost nothing. Right? So, no, I think we all need the courage to stand up, and we all need to engage in that, and we all need to say it. And I think, as I said many, many times, I think racism is an abomination. I think it's one of the ugliest things in the world. I'm disgusted by it. I remember as a child, and later as an adult, visiting South Africa during apartheid, and seeing signs that says, beach for white people only, and water fountain for white, you could only drink from it if you were white, and fountains for black, bathrooms for blacks only, for whites only, and being horrified by it, just being disgusted by it. Indeed, my parents left South Africa. They were born there and raised there because they were disgusted by apartheid and they were disgusted by that kind of racism. So there's very few things in the world that I view with more disdain. And you can see that the horrible nature of the people who come to my chat, to my chat and express racist ideas. It just truly is disgusting. And then to see people who claim to be anti-racist, who claim to be fighting racism, who claim to be the standard, the leaders, the vanguard of the anti-racist movement. And then when you discover that they're racist as bad as any white supremacist, intellectually. That is so disappointing and offensive. All right, let's see. We've got. Why doesn't she address black racism on whites and Jews? Because I said racism, by the way it's defined today, if you're an oppressed group, you can't be a racist. You can only be a racist if you're in a position of power, which means if you're in a majority. And it goes back to Ayn Rand's quote about, she says, racism is regarded as a crime if practiced by a majority, but it is as an inalienable right if practiced by a minority. And Ayn Rand wrote that in probably 69 or 68. Right? She saw it way a long time ago. Now somebody says racism is not an issue. I think racism is an issue. I think there's a lot of racism in America, and I think America has a lot of racists in it. It's used to be maybe the least racist country in the world. It's not, I don't think, today. I think there are probably several countries that are less racist. But racism is all around us. It's in Europe. I see it all over Europe. It's certainly in the United States, white supremacists on the one hand, and blacks and other minorities who are racist towards others. And we saw it in the chat. We had a racist here in the chat just a few minutes ago. And often they come in droves. I think anti-Semitism is alive and well in the United States, and always has been to some extent. I remember hitchhiking across the United States in 1979 and encountering anti-Semitism. I was from Israel, so the number of people who looked at me weird and said weird things about Jews. I'd never encountered anti-Semitism. I'd always lived in Israel. And to encounter it in the United States was strange. So no, the United States is not this wonderful utopia where racism has been abolished and anti-Semitism has been abolished. It's still there. It's not dominant. It's not a dominant feature. It's certainly not South Africa of apartheid or South Africa of today where the racism is in reverse, right? And so there's racism everywhere. To say that it's not relevant is just untrue. People don't say what they believe, but there was a guy on the chat just a few minutes ago who said blacks are inferior. So you met somebody on the chat just a few minutes ago. And again, racism today, I agree with her on this. Racism today doesn't manifest itself in people saying blacks are inferior, although there are plenty of people who say that. Just go online and look up the alt-right. Racism today manifests itself in the way they behave towards black people, not in what they say. And it manifests itself in the fact that many minorities on campuses today, whites are inferior, and treat them as inferior, and treat whites as having guilt, or, should feel guilty. And she is a racist, this woman. So racism is indeed today more around us, more in our culture, more a part of our culture than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Because it's on both sides. And it's now affecting all of our discussions. The same question. Systemic cultural racism of black rappers like Ice-T are in full vile anti-Semitic tropes of Jews. Historic racist. Farrakhan was a racist. I don't think Malcolm X was but I don't know. But Farrakhan certainly is an anti-Semite. No question about that. But yeah, I don't know the specific examples. I don't do rap. By the way, you can find Ayn Rand's discussion of racism, at least just a few notes on the Ayn Rand lexicon, AynRandLexicon.com, and just look up anything that Ayn Rand, and there was the specifics about that. Yes, I don't think Malcolm X was a racist. I wouldn't consider him a racist at all. He was to some extent a black nationalist, but at a time where blacks were being oppressed, where blacks were truly being systemic oppressed through the legal system, and he was about separation because he wanted to escape that oppression. He thought that whites were so racist and the racism was so systemic in the culture from a legal perspective, not just from a cultural perspective, that blacks would never be able to integrate into white society. All right, if it's racist to pull over blacks more than whites, is it sexist to pull over men more than women? Or is this profiling in line with crime statistics? It's not in line with traffic violation statistics. So blacks do not commit more traffic violations than whites. And I think I gave this statistic. And this is a study that looked at this. It's interesting that during the daytime, blacks are pulled over more than whites for traffic violations. In the nighttime, they're not. So when the cops can't tell what the race of the driver is, there's not a bias. When they can, there is. That to me is interesting and revealing. Now, I haven't dug deep into the study to tell you if that is statistically significant and how, but that is a published study on traffic stops, and I think there are more than one that in different localities that do that. But so I don't think traffic stops has to do with crime. If you're stopping somebody just because you don't like the way they're driving, or you're stopping somebody because you want to search their car and you're looking for an excuse, which you shouldn't be doing, cops shouldn't be doing that. If there's a bias, there are ways to test to see if the bias is real. And one way is to look at it night versus day. Doesn't dumbing down racism just make the term lose any power? I'm not sure what you mean by dumbing down racism. I don't know. I'm not sure what you mean by that. All right. Let's see if there's anything else about race. What would someone like this woman say about MLK's ideals? Does she think MLK would agree with her or disagree with her? She would say, and this is what the others say, she would say, yes. The utopian idea, one day, and this is where there's a sense in which they kind of have a Marxist view of utopia. One day, after all us whites, whip ourselves, we apologize, we feel the guilt, we are open about our systemic racism, we acknowledge it, we admit it, we go through some kind of metamorphosis. One day, in a dream, in a utopia, we will be colorblind. And that will be a great thing, she would say. But that's not possible today. And it's not possible anytime in the future. It's not possible to normal human being. We'd have to go through this metamorphosis. Just like, how does everybody become a proletarian? How do they get to this state of utopia? Well, something happens to them. Human nature changes. But to do that, you first have to have a dictatorship of the proletarian in the case of Marxism. And here you have to have this white guilt, white redistribution, reparations, white fragility. We have to admit our sins. We have to whip ourselves. And then maybe we change. But that's the utopian vision. And that's what you'd say about Martin Luther King. Not as something that is practical today. Not as something that is doable by individuals. Okay, the question is, I guess, about dumbing down racist isn't calling everyone racist, it loses its meaning. Well, it depends, right? Because I do think it's losing its meaning in their context. I think all it is now is gang warfare. It's collectivism, naked collectivism. It's this group versus that group. That's what it's boiling down to. So yes, I think a lot of whites go, I'm not a racist. There's no racist here. Give me a break. And in that sense, it loses its meaning for them. But I don't think it loses its meaning in a healthy way. Well, there is no healthy way. Yeah, I mean, what they're doing is eviscerating the meaning of racism. What racism actually means is what I described in the beginning. It's treating people based on the color of their skin, or based on their ethnic origin, or based on their genetic origins. That's what it means. And what she's trying to make it is racism is something that just is. It's almost metaphysical to our culture. Metaphysical to the fact that our culture is majority white, and whites have the wealth and the power. Political power. Okay, let's see if there's any other... Would you consider redlining systemic or institutional racism? Yes. Redlining was systemic racism. It was a government program. It wasn't a product of markets. It was a product of government regulations, government controls, both at the city and state level and at the federal level. It was part of HUD, the Housing Authority policies. It was part of state zoning laws. It was part of city and locality zoning. It was systemic racism. And I'm glad redlining has disappeared. I talked about that in my systemic racism video. Let's see if there's anything else. Opinion on corporate diversity initiatives. I have discrimination, slippery slope concerns, but know a CEO who thinks that different points of view are beneficial. Well, then get different points of view. But I don't know the points of view come with different skin colors. So I think corporate diversity initiatives, for the most part, are racist. For the most part, are artificial attempts to have quotas. If you really want diversity of points of view, then I respect that. But then you wouldn't be looking at race, or the manifestation of what they call race, skin color. As I said, I don't believe there is such a thing as race. Okay, in a new film of Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged, could any Ayn Rand character be played by black actors? Yes. I could see Mike Donegan played by one, maybe Denzel Washington. Why not John Galt? Why couldn't John Galt be black? Why couldn't Denzel Washington play Reardon O'Rourke? Why does it matter? Now, in the really, really bad remake of Atlas Shrugged, one of the characters was black, and I can't remember who it was. I think it was Reardon. But why does skin color matter? It doesn't. It doesn't. So any of the characters could be. Why does it have to be just Mike Donegan? Why can't it be, Donegan is, such an Irish name. Why can't it be John Galt? Yes, that's right. Eddie Willers, in one of the I can't remember which part of it. In one of them, Eddie Willers was black. Why not? That's great. I mean, and look at Hamilton. In Hamilton, all the founding fathers, the movie, the musical, all the founding fathers are black. Does that detract from one's ability to enjoy it? No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, I wish they hadn't done it. I wish they just chose the singers and dancers based on their skills, whatever the color of the skin happened to be. But it was an all-black cast, And it was fine. It was great, actually. I mean, because they were such good dancers and singers and actors, and they did a good job. The fact of their color of the skin didn't detract for me from enjoying the show, even though they were portraying the founding fathers who were not black. All right. Does the left associate Western civilization and success with the white race? This is their motivation for anti-white racism. I mean, they hate Western civilization, and I don't know what comes first. I think it's the hatred of Western civilization, and then, you know, race follows that. But the left definitely hates Western civilization. It hates reason and individualism. And once you reject individualism, what have you got left? You've got left collectivism. And collectivism, you know, race is just one form of collectivism. And it's one that has become very popular, well, I mean, it's always been something that people aggregated around, but today has gained intellectual legitimacy to be a racist, if you're a racist in the right direction, I guess. Thank you for being a sane voice in an insane world. It's my pleasure. I don't know any other options. I discovered which countries are best for me to have dual citizenship. A few EU, a few Asian and island nations. Thoughts on Montenegro? I mean, I like Montenegro. Montenegro is a nice place. I wouldn't want to live there. Super small, super tribal, right? Montenegrins. It's this tiny little country. Why would you have tiny little countries? I never got that. So, I mean, I think ideally I would love to have a U.S. citizenship, like a European Union citizenship, so one of the European Union countries, some Asian country, and some Latin American country. Then I could travel around the world without really just switching passports and without really any concerns about, you know, borders. That would be ideal. I mean, generally, I'd like to see a world where we didn't have passports. And now you're going to call me a globalist. I would love to see a world where we could move around freely without immigration controls, without border controls, you know, other than some minimal border controls, and go see the world. Just like you travel through Europe, you cross borders all the time, but because of the Schengen or whatever it's called, you can move around from country to country without restriction. It's amazing. You land in one country, you drive to another country. It's just, I love it, right? And I wish the world was more like that. What is the alternative to a jury system that Dr. Peikoff wants? Do you support jury nullification? The alternative to a jury system is the French system, where the purpose of the court is not to have this, what do you call it? This disagreement between two sides and who can convince a jury of who is right. But that the purpose of the court is to discover truth, the truth, what really happened. And everybody works towards the truth. The judge is actually more active, not passive. The prosecutor, the defense. The purpose of the whole proceedings is to discover the truth, what really happened. That's not the proceedings in a typical American jury trial. There it's about, you know, nobody's really out to, it's about winning. It's not about the truth. So it's a very different approach to how to resolve disputes. And I don't know which is better, and I'm not an expert. But it's very different than a jury system. Thoughts on Korean culture and country's future. I don't have a lot to say about Korean culture. I don't really know it that much. Food is fantastic. The two historical dramas that I've seen, My Country and Mr. Sunshine, are fantastic. Some of the best television I've seen anywhere. And to the extent that they say something about the culture of Korea, it's a really good culture. It's a culture that takes values seriously. It's not a culture of cynicism. But I don't know to what extent those TV series reflect the true culture of Korea. So I actually don't know. I hope that those TV series are a reflection of the nature of that culture. The country's future, unfortunately, they have a very leftist president right now, very leftist, appeasing policies towards North Korea, and bad economic policies that are destroying or at least undermining a lot of the great achievements that they've achieved since the 1950s, where they were poorer than North Korea, and today have become one of the richest countries in the world. So I don't know what the future is. I don't know enough about South Korea to be able to say what the future is. I hope that they embrace liberty and they embrace freedom, and then the future's unlimited. They can be an amazing story. As it is, if you go to Korea, it's a stunning, I mean, Seoul, Korea is a stunning city. Skyscrapers everywhere, tall buildings, beautiful river going through the city, mountains in the background, very pretty. People are friendly. You can manage with English. Yeah, I mean, I like Asia. I've always liked Asia since I went there for the first time in the early 2000s. And it's really, really interesting. Right? So, yeah, if you want to ask questions, any additional questions, we're running out of time. But you can do so by using Super Chat feature. Will you ever do another show on best countries? Maybe. I don't know. Has anything changed since I did my last show? Is there something new I could say? I'm not sure. Everything's so mediocre. There's no outstanding countries right now that for me to get excited about. Anti-capitalists are paranoid about monopolies based on these far-fetched scenarios they create. Why are they so animated by monopolies? Well, because they don't understand how markets work. They've been taught in the economics class that monopolies are market failure and this disaster. They've been taught that the ideal is something called perfect competition, which is a platonic ideal and a complete BS in reality. But philosophically, it's because they can't differentiate between economic power and political power. And they have a confusion about the two. Political power is very dangerous because it involves a gun. It involves the rule of the gun. It's enforced, laws enforced by a gun. So it's power backed by a gun. Economic power is voluntary power. You can walk away. If a monopoly is always confused, if a monopoly is achieved through the gun, through government favors, for example, then it really is bad. But if a monopoly is achieved through monopoly in the sense of high market share, achieved through a market, then it's not bad. But people have a hard time differentiating between the economic power, which is voluntary, and the political power. That's a topic we'll talk a lot more about in the future show. Harry Binswanger has an entire essay on the difference between political and economic power, and it's excellent. So I encourage you to look that up. Look up economic versus political power, Harry Binswanger. All right, I think we're done. And remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Remember to consider supporting the show if you haven't already. And I know many of you have not yet. You can just do $2 a month, or you can do Super Chat with a few dollars. Or there are plenty of ways in which you can support the show. Patreon, Subscribe Star. And of course, don't forget to like and share and all the other good things that social media allows. You are my agents out there in the world. If we're going to change the world, it will be because of you. I am one voice. You multiply it by several thousands. You get my word out to thousands, potentially millions of people. Use that power to get good ideas out there into the world and to help me, help you change the world. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. See you